It's so nice to see so many familiar faces. Hi. Yate, Nizhóní Begay Yenishye, Nakainishle Hashklishtin Bashishtin, Ketchwadasite, Todachini Dashanale. My name is Nizhóní Begay. I am Dene and Quechua, and I serve as the communications coordinator at the Water Protector Legal Collective. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight's discussion is hosted by Water Protector Legal Collective and Indigenous Peoples Rights International. So a little bit on the Water Protector Legal Collective. We are an Indigenous-led legal nonprofit that provides support and advocacy for our peoples, our Indigenous peoples and original nations, the earth, and climate justice movements. And a little on IPRI, the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, is a legally registered nonprofit global Indigenous peoples organization that works to protect Indigenous peoples' rights and unite and amplify the call for justice to victims of criminalization and impunity. Our discussion today is going to be focused on addressing pressing issues of how the law meant to protect human rights defenders is under siege. Around the world, Indigenous peoples and the earth experience challenges and violence, including access to justice and the impacts of a legal system that was not built for Indigenous peoples and prioritizes property rights over the sacredness of earth. As Indigenous peoples, we are 5% of the world's population, but we steward 85% of the world's biodiversity. Corporate interests, extraction, and the rights of Indigenous peoples are inextricably linked as frontline human rights defenders work to defend the earth and its existence itself. In 2022, frontline defenders reported a grim milestone. For the first time, we saw more than 400 targeted killings of human rights defenders in Latin America, known as Abyayala in the language of the Kuna peoples, remained the deadliest region in the world for human rights defenders. The 5 most targeted sectors of human rights defense were environmental, land, and Indigenous peoples' rights, freedom of expression, protest movement, freedom of assembly, women's rights, and impunity and an access to justice. 401 human rights defenders were killed in 26 countries in 2022, compared to 358 human rights defenders in 35 countries in 2021. These are everyday struggles for Indigenous peoples across the world. Tonight, we will hear from human rights attorneys working at the intersection of protecting Indigenous peoples' rights and the earth on a frontline legal community in partnership with our relatives. So I'm going to just quickly introduce all of our speakers. They have incredible bios and are incredible peoples who I am inspired by, so I'm really blessed and honored to be able to introduce them. Joan Carling is an Indigenous activist from Cordillera with more than 20 years of working on Indigenous issues from the grassroots level to the international level. Her expertise includes areas like human rights, sustainable development, the environment, climate change, and additionally, the application of free, prior, and informed consent. She was the General Secretary of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP, from September 2008 to December 2016. She was appointed as Indigenous Expert of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2014 to 2016 by the United Nations Economic and Social Council. She was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the UN Environment in September 18th, and she was awarded the Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award by the UN Environment. Now we also have Marr, who's seated here. Marr, managing attorney of Forum Nobis, has worked as a human rights consultant, lawyer, law professor, and activist for over 20 years. Teaches human rights law at several law schools, and his courses and publications focus on the history and philosophy of human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, environmental rights, global supply chains, labor movements, corporate legal accountability, the business and human rights framework, technology impacts, and advocacy strategies. He spent over a decade representing human rights defender Donziger, seated right next to me, And he is widely recognized as the most egregious strategic lawsuit recognized as the most strategic lawsuit against public participation and misuse of the United States justice system in recent times. Early in his career, Aaron worked with the South African Human Rights Commission in Cape Town, South Africa, with development finance institutions in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, with Sudanese refugees in Cairo, Egypt, and with communities affected by oil contamination in the Amazon region of Ecuador. Aaron's current focus is on the practice of human rights due diligence, HRDD, which has the potential to transform the practice of human rights and to drive equity, inclusion, and justice in the global economy and the practice of international institutions. Aaron is trying to help steer the ship towards potential by promoting the advantages and unpacking the complexities of HRDD-based approaches to both advocates and organizations, teaching and publishing in the field of business and human rights, and contributing to the development of high-integrity work within the field. Natali Segovia, Natali Segovia is a Quechua international human rights attorney who currently serves as the executive director of the Water Protector Legal Collective, an indigenous-led legal organization that grew out of the No Dapple resistance at Standing Rock, and today continues to provide legal support and advocacy for indigenous peoples, the earth, and climate justice movements. As a litigator and advocate, Natali's work focuses on the protection of the earth and the rights of indigenous peoples affected by forced displacement, desecration of sacred lands, and human rights violations as a result of extractive industry and mass development projects. For over 15 years, her international work has focused on addressing human rights violations as a result of extractive industry and mass development projects in rural, unseen areas in countries like Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. Natali also frequently lectures and teaches at law schools across the United States, and in 2022 was the Fall Givelber Distinguished Public Interest Lecturer at Northeastern University School of Law, where she taught In Defense of the Sacred, Human Rights, Earth Justice, and the Law. Courses also taught include Indigenous Peoples and Colonial Law and Unsettled Indigenous Peoples Struggles for Defense, Water, Land, and Human Rights at the City University of New York, Cooney School of Law. Natali holds a law degree from Arizona State University and dual degrees in political science and Latin American studies from Columbia University. She currently serves on the scientific committee of the Monique and Roland Wheels People's Academy of International Law. And finally, human rights attorney Stephen Donziger has been fighting Chevron for over 20 years for damages Chevron caused to the Ecuadorian Amazon, to indigenous and rural communities who call the Amazon home. In 2010, Donziger helped with a historic $9.5 billion judgment in favor of indigenous and rural plaintiffs in Ecuador affected by the oil pollution caused by Chevron in the Lago Agrio oil field case. Since then, Chevron has spent $2 billion on lawyers, private investigators, and public relations consultants to retaliate against and demonize Donziger for his human rights advocacy, weaponizing the law against him in slap suits, such as the underlying RICO case that led to a misdemeanor contempt charge where Chevron claimed the judgment in Ecuador was a product of fraud. And now I will have our relatives at the People's Forum queue up a video for us to contextualize some of what we have just been talking about.
I always remember a story Umberto talks about a lot of how when he was a little kid, there's an enormous river in front of the village where he lives in the forest, and one day it just became absolutely riven with black oil. When you see the river on fire that your people have depended on for 1,000 years because of oil contamination, you see your life and your future go up in flames.
What some environmentalists call the world's worst oil-related disaster.
Usted es un abogado corrupto.
My name is Stephen Donziger. I was there in Ecuador when indigenous groups and Amazon communities were fighting Chevron in an epic battle for justice. My first trip to Ecuador was in April of 1993. I went down with some lawyers and scientists to investigate reports that Texaco had dumped literally billions of gallons of toxic oil waste into the pristine Amazon rainforest where indigenous groups live. No one really knew what would happen as a result of the trip, but one thing that did happen is those who went on it all committed to trying to do something to address the problem and to help the people and to hold Texaco, now Chevron, accountable for what looked like a massive human rights problem that was done deliberately. On my first trip, I was shocked by what we found. I expected to see pollution. I was shocked by the extent of it. Massive pools of oil, literally thousands of them all over the rainforest. The oil was on their clothes, it was in the air they breathed, it was in the food they ate, it was in the water that they drank. It was an apocalyptic nightmare. When you drill an oil well, you go thousands of feet underground, and all this rock and heavy metals and man-made chemicals that cause cancer come up out of the ground with the oil, and you have to put it somewhere, and they just put it in unlined pits in the jungle. In many of the pits, they built pipes on the sides to take the overflow into the nearby rivers and streams where people were using for their drinking water without telling the people that they were doing this.
Texaco utilizó la tecnología más barata con tal de tener mayores ganancias como recursos económicos, pero a cambio del mayor efecto ambiental y el mayor efecto en la salud de la gente.
I saw things that were unbelievably horrid.
De 20 niños que nacen, a 15, 16 niños les da esto.
People living in abject poverty because they couldn't escape the contamination.
Ahora es con mi hija, que tan guambra es mi hija y que tenga esa enfermedad como es el cáncer.
There are people there that are sick. It's a very poor region. There's absolutely no evidence that there's an increase in cancer rate.
And once you see it, and this was certainly true for me, you can't really turn your back on it. The trip changed my life. Out of that trip, we talked to people who wanted legal representation. These are all unique cultures. The Siona, the Quechua, the Kofan, the Sequoia, the Waorani all have their own languages and their own villages. Some are more farming-oriented, others are more hunting, but all of them were 100% dependent on the forest for their survival. But once the oil came and poisoned this delicate ecosystem, they could no longer rely on their traditional sources of food and water. During the first 10 years of the case, we were fighting to have a jury trial in the United States. Texaco and Chevron did not want that. They were petrified of a jury. They were desperate to shift the case back to Ecuador, where they would continue with their impunity. The case ended up getting shifted to Ecuador. On the very first day of the trial, in October of 2003, in Ecuador, after Chevron had agreed to accept jurisdiction there, literally the first thing they did was challenge jurisdiction. They accepted jurisdiction in the United States to get it to Ecuador. Then we got there and they're like, oh, you don't have jurisdiction over us. And that began years and years of completely bad faith, in my mind, unethical litigation tactics. Chevron's trial strategy was to sabotage the trial.
Nosotros no manipulamos. Nosotros fuimos los que pedimos venir aquí al Ecuador a ser
Esto es lo que hay en el Oriente. Yo les invito a ver. Yo les invito a ver esto.
Chevron did not want any litigation on the merits of the claims of the Ecuadorians. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. They paid one of their employees, Diego Borja, to try to entrap a judge in a bribery scandal. He taped it through a pen.
Yeah.
This is all the Chevron Texaco case.
You've read all of this?
Ya ha leído todo usted.
Poco, no mucho.
They were constantly filing dozens and dozens of trial motions in like a very short period of time, like an hour, to stop the court from functioning properly.
Eso abogado corrupto de Texaco.
Señor, usted va a responder por sus palabras.
Yo estoy respondiendo, señor. Usted es un abogado corrupto.
Chevron would then file more motions to recuse the judge from the case. And that motion would then go to another judge, and it would delay the trial for 6 months.
Part of Texaco's strategy is to bankrupt us.
So Chevron has gone out of its way to avoid talking about the real issue, which is that it committed environmental crimes in Ecuador that have devastated indigenous groups, devastated farming communities, poisoned this incredibly important ecosystem that's critical to the survival of the planet for all of us. They don't want to talk about that. Why? Because it will undermine their business model. Chevron and other fossil fuel companies like to go into areas, take out the oil, get all the profits they can, and leave behind massive pollution that the public or the area communities have to pay. They report these enormous profits, but we, meaning the people, are actually subsidizing them because we're paying the cost for their pollution while they get the profits. So the case in Ecuador ended on February 14th, 2011 with a resounding victory for the affected communities. But up to this point, even though the people in Ecuador won the case, they've yet to receive the first dollar of their judgment.
Vimos la dramática presentación ahí, en que todo el mundo ya asumió que ese material que salía era petróleo y tenía la marca Texaco. Yo no observé ninguna marca.
Chevron knows if the people of Ecuador who've won this judgment are able to collect it, the floodgates will open and there will be potentially $1 trillion+ of liability, because what they did in Ecuador, they've done in dozens of countries around the world.
There are environmental problems in the region. We're not denying that.
Todo esto es petróleo. Mira.
But those environmental problems are the responsibility of the Ecuadorian state. We did our part. Texaco did its part.
For someone to say that we just push dirt on the spits, it's absolutely untrue.
They basically have concluded that it's cheaper to pay hundreds of lawyers to fight this than to pay the people they harmed. Because once that happens once, the chances of it happening dozens more times increase dramatically, and their whole business model gets destroyed. It is a business model based on privatizing profits and socializing costs to the most vulnerable people on the planet. This case is about challenging that, ending it, holding it accountable, which is why they are spending massive sums of money to try to destroy my life and hold me up as some sort of scalp that they can put on the walls of their homes like hunters put a moose head up. That's really what they want out of me. I am a human rights lawyer, detained in the United States of America on bogus charges to help a U.S. company evade a $10 billion environmental liability owed to the most vulnerable indigenous groups in the Amazon. So what's the point of this other than to punish me for my successful human rights advocacy for the people of Ecuador? Their entire strategy now is to sue anyone who wants to help the case, including the lawyers, including me. You know, I think there's a larger lesson to be learned from this experience. If we let the fossil fuel industry continue along its path, we will no longer have a planet. And, you know, you can look at this as, oh, there's this pollution and they sued and there's all this litigation. Or you can look at it as the first step of a new way of thinking. The idea that you can leverage resources such that communities understand that they have the power to form alliances around the world to hold the perpetrators of these environmental crimes and human rights violations fully accountable, such that they stop doing it. We will have a better world. And it's important not to get distracted by what's happening to any one individual, in this case me, because I'm in a difficult situation. It's important to understand that and to help me and to protect me and others like me. But we cannot preserve our planet for our children, for our grandchildren, for future generations unless this work is done.
And so with this context of Chevron versus the indigenous peoples of the Ecuadorian Amazon and other cases of extractivism, I am hoping that we can have a conversation tonight to help us understand the structural and the legal challenges facing human rights defenders and indigenous peoples working in defense of our Mother Earth. And we've talked a lot. We've watched the video. I can't wait to get into conversation, so I'm just going to go ahead and start. If it's okay with you, Joan, I have a specific question for you. The organization that you lead, Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, as a reminder, and as an expert in human rights in the international arena, working to bring light to criminalization of human rights defenders on the international level, what are some of the challenges and also possibilities you are seeing on the international level?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, and good evening to everyone. Sorry, I'm the movie and the documentary actually is going to be is demonstrating what can happen to the rest of indigenous peoples, not just from fossil fuel, but also with the renewable energy transition, given the imposition of renewable energy projects that will again displace communities, but also with the transition minerals. And the current approach is still business as usual. So you can see how things will multiply. But just to mention first that from the work that we do on against the criminalization of indigenous peoples, just want to provide the two kinds of how indigenous peoples are being criminalized. First is the lack of full and legal recognition of the collective rights of indigenous peoples, and instead laws and policies are penalizing the exercise and practice of our ways of life. And just to give an example, many laws and policies are prohibiting or restricting our traditional livelihoods, from hunting to gathering of forest products, to fishing, to rotational agriculture, which is very much part of us, is penalized by law. So that's one, and that is very much linked to how we also exercise our rights over our natural resources, and of course the right to our lands, territories, and resources. And that is really resulting to many cases of criminalization, not just by individuals but communities, right? And that also leads to the second form of criminalization, that when we defend and protect our rights, we again face criminalization. And these are the trump-up charges put against us, or that the prohibition also of our fundamental rights and freedoms, like when we speak out against this kind of projects, we face charges that are usually trump-up cases. So with these two forms of criminalization, the challenges that we face now as we speak is what I mentioned in line with the so-called global solutions to the global climate crisis. And that is a major challenge for indigenous peoples as they impose and rush the green transition that is not just, that is not fair, that is not equitable and not sustainable, and it's not even green. It's not even green, right? So for example, the large dams that are going to be built again are actually destroying the river ecosystems and causing a lot of devastation of our livelihoods. The region that I come from the Philippines, in the Cordillera, we're able to prevent, the reason why we have a strong movement was because of the strong opposition of a large dam, a series of dams in the 70s. And now, in the name of climate change solutions, more than 50 dams, 50 large dams are planned just in one region, because we're from the mountains, so all the watershed and river bodies come from our area, and that is now the plan. And at the same time, in other places, we also see the mining of transition minerals. Nickel and lithium is in the area of indigenous peoples, right, in Latin America. Cobalt is in the area of indigenous peoples in Africa. And in these territories, indigenous peoples are already suffering from the lack of recognition of their rights. They don't have any of the basic services, and now their lands are again going to be grabbed. This is the kind of scenario that we anticipate to happen. Now, what are the other forms of, what are the other challenges that we face in this situation? One is as we've seen clearly in the case of Chevron, corporations and investors do not have strong regulatory frameworks to respect rights and protect indigenous peoples. And that comes along with also the obligation of states that they don't regulate these companies. They are allowed to violate our rights, pollute our resources with impunity. So that is actually against the obligation of the states to protect our rights. We also see that in many communities, they are actually not aware of their rights and not aware of the tools that they can use also to defend their rights. So when they get criminalized, I've seen, for example, in Thailand, where many of them are put to jail because of them going to the national park to get honey or to cut trees for firewood or to build their house. So they get arrested, they end up in jail. The community mobilized funds to bring them out, and the next week, 5 of them again are brought to jail. And the community, it's a never-ending. So yeah, so it's systemic. It's in the law. So they said, no matter what we do, if the law is not changed, thousands of us will end up in jail, and we become poorer because we have to always pay the penalty. Right? In the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, when they end up in jail, the government does not even provide them food. So the family will have to be going to jail every day to give them food. And these are already poor families. These are already marginalized families. So this also demonstrates the lack of justice, even within in the countries that we work with. And we anticipate this also to worsen with the imposition, again, of fortress conservation. We know globally about the global biodiversity framework, where 30%, the target is to increase 30% of biodiversity to be protected. That's very good. And in fact, we should protect more than 30%. to sustain the planet. The problem is the fortress approach that they do on conservation is that they isolate people from the biodiversity because we are accused the people as destroyers, so thereby we are taken out. But that's an attack to who we are in the way that we maintain an intrinsic and reciprocal relations with nature. And if that's going to happen, millions of indigenous peoples are not just going to be displaced, right? Millions are going to end up being more marginalized, and that women especially will again be the losing end. One of the impact of this, for example, the moment we are taken out of our territories, women become more highly vulnerable to violence because the wider society take advantage when women, indigenous women, are out of our comfort zones. And that's exactly where many abuse happen. And even in the conservation areas, both outside the conservation areas and inside the conservation areas, because when women go to gather traditional medicines, they end up being raped and being abused by national park guards. And that is happening all over, and it remains invisible because they cannot even afford to go to court and even to report, because that means more women will be victimized. Right? So that is the other dimension of the kind of criminalization that we're dealing with on the ground. So the other one that I want to mention is in relation to this disproportionate incarceration of indigenous peoples because of the trumped-up charges. Like when we assert and protect our rights and exercise our rights, that's when we get arrested and jailed. All over, from US to Guatemala to Indonesia to DRC to Australia to New Zealand, indigenous peoples are more than 50% of those in jail. And women are even higher in rates. And that shows the lack of justice that we are, the issue of access to justice. We're not just having access to, I mean, it's clearly a double jeopardy. One, the arrest is already, the charges are false. We end up in jail and we don't even have access to justice. And so these are the issues that we're working on and the challenges that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. And then if we can just go down the line, that makes the most sense? Okay, cool. So next, Natali, at the Water Protector Legal Collective, we work to protect protectors. That has become sort of our slogan at WPLC. So water protectors and land defenders that are standing to protect the water itself. This panel is titled Under Siege. So what are the trends that you are seeing kind of bringing it to Turtle Island, to the United States, that affect how indigenous peoples who are seeking to protect 80%, again, of the world's biodiversity are impacted by the law?
Thank you. Ayanchu noka sutimi Natali Segovia nyoka koskoperum antakani anchatan anchaiki kaipikas kaikimanta. Thank you so much for being here. I am honored to be here and share this space with these wonderful human rights defenders, human rights expert, and human rights attorneys that I have the honor to call friends and colleagues. And thank you also to our elders that are here tonight. I want to acknowledge the presence of Sandra Creamer, who comes all the way from Australia. Sandra. Thank you. And several of our other elders, thank you for being here. You know, this conversation has has been imagined for a long time. Joan's long trajectory in the international arena and the work that we are doing in many ways as sister organizations, really your advocacy in the international realm. And Water Protector Legal Collective started at Standing Rock in 2016, and it started out of a need, right, to fill this need that you were describing, to protect protectors, to protect water protectors and land defenders, specifically on Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota territories, unceded treaty territories that were where a pipeline was being put across their territory, unceded treaty territory, only one and a half miles away from the reservation itself, endangering the waters of not only Indigenous peoples, but also people in Bismarck and other cities. So when we're talking about the protection of protectors and protection of the earth and the water, it's not just Indigenous peoples that we're talking about protecting. We're doing this work for everyone. And we're doing this work to protect the earth and the water that affects everyone. And so with Standing Rock in particular, there were 800 criminal cases that came out of that resistance. 800 criminal cases, many of which were eventually dismissed. And so we see the state repression and criminalization of defense and of protest. And what has changed in the past decade has been the rise of social media, right? We are now seeing live streamed. There's some events happening at Columbia University, my alma mater, in the past couple of days. But we're seeing live streamed, right? The effect of what is happening on the ground every single day in a way that we would not have seen in prior times. But these are historical struggles. As Indigenous peoples, we know this well. We know that these are things that have happened for centuries, but they were not televised and they were not streamed and they were not something that was visible, right? So we talk a lot at Water Protector Legal Collective about making the unseen visible and really providing as a legal front line, as a holding line to those that are on the front lines and the water and the earth itself, protection, and finding legal strategies so that we are not always on the back foot, because oftentimes we are forced as Indigenous peoples to be in a reactive space, to constantly be in a state of emergency, to constantly have to respond to the crises that face our peoples. Joan was mentioning the attacks on women, and in the United States and throughout the world, but the United States is not an exception. You know, the United Nations headquarters is here and in Geneva, and sometimes here in the framework of the US, there is a sense that we are a city on a shining hill, and that there is a moral high ground in the United States, or so-called United States, what we know as Turtle Island, that we are a country and have done and have this amazing human rights record. But the reality that we see and we know as Indigenous peoples is that that human rights record is not actually unblemished. There are so many blemishes on that human rights record that we would probably be here for days if we chose to talk about them all. Part of it is the lack of corporate accountability that we're seeing, like Chevron, a US-based corporation, committing crimes, right, all over the world. Ecuador was one instance, probably the most egregious, but there is this excellent report by Dr. Nan Greer that's talked about the impact of Chevron in, I think, over 100 countries. And Chevron's not the only oil company, right? So in the work that we're doing, we're seeing the ongoing criminalization with pipelines in particular, all forms of extractive industry. At Line 3, which ran from northern part of Canada down through Minnesota, there was over 900 arrests and 900 criminal cases brought against Indigenous and allies, non-Indigenous water protectors and land defenders that were arrested as part of their protest. And so we see the ongoing criminalization and repression. And then over the past 50 years, since the 1970s, we've seen the rise of the industry-coined terminology, ecoterrorism. So ecoterrorism as a phrase was coined by a corporation, essentially, describing, and they said, we're going to define ecoterrorism as everything that runs the gamut from, nonviolent direct action to crimes of homicide. And so in that large range of crimes, those, they're talking about everything under the sun can be labeled ecoterrorism. And we have seen since the 1970s that rise of language over the past 50 years of ecoterrorism and ecoterrorism charges. Recently, there have been strategic lawsuits against public participation after the Dakota Access Pipeline was pushed through, first under the Obama administration and then fast-tracked under the Trump administration. It is operating illegally currently without proper water permits, and it has continued to operate under the Biden administration. And so this is the difficult situation that we're living in within the United States and what we are facing when we are talking about how do we address these issues as Indigenous peoples and also as lawyers, right, or as human rights defenders that are looking to shift the law and push the law in the direction that it should be, right, to protect the rights of peoples and to protect the rights and also the well-being not only of humans but also all of our relatives. This week is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which I know many of you here in attendance are already there, but one thing that Vice President of Bolivia, David Choquehuanca, has mentioned repeatedly is the need for additional guarantees within the law to protect the rights of Indigenous peoples, of original nations, right? Not just the term that we've had to sort of use as Indigenous peoples, but original nations as naciones originarias that predate and precede these settler nations and settler states, right, that are the member states of the United Nations. But another thing he's been talking about is the importance of moving away from the human and the Anthropocene and moving towards I think he said cosmobiocentrico. He said cosmo-biocentric, right? Thinking about how do we prioritize and how do we recenter and reframe our thinking in terms of the earth and the cosmos itself. So we have a lot of work cut out for us, I think, unfortunately, probably many, many, many years. But it's work that I think at this point in time, we are not only preparing for, but we're looking for proactively in a way that is different. I think today, where we are ready to address things proactively instead of waiting for things to happen to us. We know what we have to do, and we know the challenges that we're facing, and we're here, and we're prepared, and we are going to rise to meet them. Thank you.
Coming down the line. No one's safe. Aaron, you represented Stephen on a slap RICO case against related to the Chevron case, in Ecuador, and you do work in corporate accountability. How do you see us in this current moment that we are in, and what are the possibilities and limitations for finding corporate accountability on the international level? Take it away, Aaron.
Okay. Thank you for the question and the introduction, and thank you, Joan and Natali, for those contributions. I mean, I know these stories and I know these statistics, but I still find myself, my mind is reeling and heart is sinking. We were joking earlier that hopefully there's time for multiple interventions, because the first contribution is going to get dark, and there are lines where we can get. Sorry, I need to speak in here. There are lines of hope. There are thoughts or feelings that I also want to be able to share. But yeah, I think we do need to get dark to some degree to recognize what's happening here. Accountability is, it's a tough one. I do teach a human rights course this semester. It's a survey course, and as we got into the space of legal accountability using the court system. I mean, I told my students, I was like, folks, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I should be allowed to teach this course anymore, given where my head is at, given I'm still processing what's happened and my experience with the court system over the last couple of years. But let me try to talk for a little bit about the role of the attacks on human rights defenders in the corporate strategies, in the playbooks that we're seeing. And let me pick up a little bit. We heard this international perspective, or the perspective from Indigenous peoples. We heard the perspective from the US, and we brought it here. So, and again, I don't think, probably this audience, we don't need to talk too much about. Turns out that this occurs in the United States as well. Turns out we have plenty of struggles with the justice system in the United States. A lot of people are going to be very familiar with that concept. But let me also then focus us on how does this happen in big cases? As you saw, like our judgment was reported in the New York Times, right? Like we were privileged to have a lot of attention in that environmental lawsuit. It was a big multi-billion-dollar case. We were able to get, we had a team, and in that sense, how does this kind of strategy work in a big case? How does it work in a good case as well? And I think for folks who are interested in social justice, how does it? I mean, you saw the contamination in the Chevron case, right? This isn't subtle. You could fall into it, right? It was right there. And we had a really good strategy in the sense that we were ultimately brought to Ecuador, but we got a judgment from the Ecuadorian courts. That was a really good judgment based on very good science and was ultimately affirmed by the Ecuadorian appellate courts, the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court. Once you get a judgment like that, you can take it all around the world. We knew Chevron was never going to pay it in Ecuador, right? But you can take it to any court system. And there's an established legal system which says it's judicial comity. You have to respect the judgments of other courts around the world. So suddenly you get this judgment, and Chevron's a judgment debtor, right? It can only make certain arguments, and you've got hundreds, 150 court systems open to you. So it's a good strategy, and we had a good team. So what role in that context suddenly do we start to see the attacks on human rights defenders, right? And I said I'm going to look at a couple of different phases really quickly. I said I would limit myself to one scandalous fact per stage, because there's just too many. So they begin with this RICO case where they say the whole thing is a product of fraud and bribery, okay? The bribery allegation comes from a single witness who was an Ecuadorian judge who was fired for corruption. They paid cash to the witness. So this is maybe a legal point, but you're not supposed to do that. You're not allowed to do that. It's quite clear you're not allowed to pay a fact witness. How like we can go on arguing about like, well, maybe what he said was true anyway. It almost doesn't matter, right? Like why are they allowed to pay him? Okay, so one of the reasons why they were allowed to pay him, or that the court system was able to take this fact in, okay, is that they hired an ethics professor to come in and say, well, actually, in this particular case, for these particular reasons, as long as you don't do X, Y, and Z, you can go ahead and pay for this testimony. Now, what's great about this is they went ahead and did X, Y, and Z. So they had to go back to the professor and get a second opinion, which says, okay, so you did X, Y, and Z, but you can't do A, B, and C. Well, they went ahead and did A, B, and C. And so there are 3 different amended opinions from this ethics professor saying that what they did was okay. All right. They found other ways of doing all sorts of like technical reports and forensic reports on random documents and so forth like that. So they create this really elaborate system where it seems like this is okay. But at the end of the day, right, it was like a paid witness, which is the only source of this bribery allegation. I'm going to limit myself there, right? You can see me spiraling off on all the facts here. So that's not, they used this they called it racketeering, and they used it to get an injunction against, and it was very personal. This is where we saw the language. This was part of the demonized Donziger strategy, and that's not a characterization that comes from an email from their key strategist using the word demonize. Demonized Donziger. So the injunction doesn't quite work. Okay, so we keep going. We do have this really good strategy, right? And it turns out other court systems aren't really that convinced that the paid witness testimony ought to really be the answer to this case of what's going on in Ecuador. So we do encounter a lot of difficulties in enforcing. There is that. But at some point, it's still going, right? And you can see their problem. Wait a minute. This is a global effort. How are we going to shut this down, silence this entirely? And that's where suddenly new litigation appears against Stephen. This was at a point when all that case had really died down. And the criminal charges appear. And these are criminal contempt charges. And so my scandalous fact here, and again, there's so many to choose from, but we'll go with the private appointment, right? So judges can issue criminal contempt charges. It's a thing that a lot of human rights defenders have faced. Here, the public prosecutor refused to prosecute these charges. And this is a judge who is spent much of the case talking about Chevron as a company of considerable importance to our economy, right? So like we sort of knew where this was coming. The prosecutor refuses to prosecute, and so the judge appoints private lawyers to serve as the prosecutor. Okay, and so how does this happen, right? There is a little judicial rule that seems to allow this, but it's really never been used before. Then appoints a law firm that has links to Chevron to do this. And then this sort of opens up, we ultimately find like all these emails between, like Chevron's lawyers are emailing them late at night and basically supporting the case of this sort of private prosecution. And it's never, and again, this has never been done before, but they maintain this structure and they keep calling these private prosecutors the government, and they use the whole structure and the legitimacy of the criminal court system to push this through. And, I think we'll get to messages of hope, but at some point that was a terrifying experience for Stephen, and he'll speak to it, and it was very difficult. But it was also so scandalous that it really started to crystallize, I think, in the public imagination what was going on here. I'll just sort of note that we did take Stephen's, he was ultimately prosecuted and convicted of this misdemeanor criminal contempt. Talk a little bit more about that. No one really has ever served out time for a misdemeanor criminal contempt. The rules were completely different. Sorry, I'm doing more scandalous facts. I said I was just going to do the one. We get up to the Supreme Court, and we do get a very strong dissent saying the Constitution does not tolerate what happened here. One of the things I'm reminded of from Joan's comments is we got that decision from two of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court that still kind of see their role as aggrieved by the U.S. legal system, and the liberal justices were not as troubled with a rule that gave judges this power to do this. And I haven't quite thought it through 100%, but I'm connecting this also to the fact that we can't see this too linearly, like you talked about the new, some of this type of oppression emerging from the struggle to fight climate change, right? And from the green economy. And these things are going to get complex, and we sort of see these layers of power operating such that, how we define kind of allies and who's using power becomes a really important question. So I think I'll leave it. I kind of wanted to flesh out a little bit and give just some examples of how this operates at, there's a level at which the much broader sectors of American society, global society, professionalism is really willing to engage this in these human rights defenders. So just to make sure that we understand that this isn't, while the kinds of oppression that are happening at the local level are incredibly important, we really need to bear in mind how deep this can go. And I think that's one of the purposes that the Chevron case can really start to be, and that will point towards the issues of solidarity and other things that we'll probably get to later. So thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. And finally, mi comadre, Stephen. Why is this work so important right now? what are your main takeaways from being on the receiving end of a slap suit? But perhaps most importantly, what have you learned in representing Indigenous peoples and rural communities of the Ecuadorian Amazon against Chevron?
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm honored to be here. Joan, I've always admired your work. Natali and Aaron represent me now, and I'm seeking a pardon for this conviction we're talking about from President Biden. And they do great work, and I'm just so honored to work with them and collaborate with them. And Aaron has just stuck by me and the people of Ecuador for what, 25 years now? Thank you, my friend. Really appreciate it. I would not be here but for this guy. So, really appreciate it. I just want to acknowledge at the outset that when I first went to Ecuador in 1993, I went as an outsider. I am not indigenous. I am a Caucasian male of relative privilege. I went to Harvard Law School, and I got out of law school wanting to help people. And in answer to one part of your question, I, at the beginning, had a lot of good intentions, and I didn't know a lot about this world or what I was doing. And I can say, while I went with sort of the arrogance of a young American lawyer, thinking I'm going to teach my clients how to do this, over time I realized they taught me a lot more, than I taught them about life and about lots of things. And the process of working, I've been to Ecuador over 250 times. I live here in the city. The process of, grinding year after year, particularly down in Ecuador when the trial was moved to Ecuador, led to what I would call really rich relationships that I'm privileged to have, especially as a person from here. So I want to acknowledge that. I never really saw my role, even when I was kind of in my more arrogant days, as anything other than a service provider. I mean, I now feel like a collaborator and, but we still have differences. And I think it's really important as lawyers. A lot of people think, oh, this is this big case. It's like Stephen Donziger did this case and Stephen Donziger won this case. That's not what happened. Stephen Donziger was a lawyer on a team with a lot of other lawyers, including some incredibly talented Ecuadorian lawyers, that basically ended up kicking some Chevron ass in an historic way. And I'm really proud of that. And I'm proud of my role on this team. I want to acknowledge it. But there was an incredible team of many, many lawyers who did this. But sort of that leads to my second point is, why did they go after me? Well, they went after me because as they assessed, I think, the landscape of the case, they thought that if they could get me, is that me or you? I'm sorry, my phone.
That's okay.
If they could get me out, they felt, I think, that the case would go away. Or they would be able to not pay the people that they poisoned. And they went after me with a ferocity that really was shocking to me. I mean, I'm not stupid. Like, I tried to anticipate worst case scenarios, and I never anticipated that they could do what they ended up doing to me. Sorry, hold this. I'm turning this phone off.
No worries.
This is very aggravating. Someone from Ecuador.
I was gonna say.
There's someone from Ecuador.
Here, I can thank you. Okay.
In any event, I think the lesson, and what I've noticed, apropos to I think what Natali and Joan and Aaron have been talking about, there was a time when the industry and sort of the forces of government in our society tried to pretend that we live in a rule of law country. They tried to pretend that the rules apply to everybody, even though we know they really didn't. And I would say now, and I just came from Columbia, where there is a complete militarization of the Columbia University campus to silence pro-Palestinian protesters, and it's really disturbing. I live up in that neighborhood. And I think what's happening at Columbia, what happened to me, being locked up under a bogus misdemeanor case, What's happening to Greenpeace right now, which faces a racketeering case in federal court in North Dakota. They're trying to shut down Greenpeace. Greenpeace, really the nation's, in the world's first major environmental organization, founded in the early 1970s in Canada. They're not hiding it anymore, like they tried to. And I would say what they did to me, you know, and think about it, I am a man of privilege. They did it to me. I never imagined they could do it to a Harvard Law grad like me. Barack Obama was one of my classmates. Neil Gorsuch on the US Supreme Court, one of my classmates. So it never, like, I never thought they could do it. And what I found is, I think psychologically and emotionally, I don't know if you guys would agree with this, they were even more furious with a guy like me, you know? Like, I betrayed my class.
Exactly. You're a traitor.
I'm a traitor to my class and to my privilege. And the judge who really orchestrated this detention, Lewis Kaplan, it's weird. We have like some weird shit in common. Like, we're both Jewish. We both went to Harvard Law School. That's about it. He went to he worked in the corporate defense world, like representing the tobacco companies in the years and years of litigation as people were dying from smoking lung cancer. And I went down to Ecuador and like was walking around these oil fields. And I think he just hated me, that I chose this as my career. But, you know, the bigger issue, and I started to feel this as they really started to go after me, and it wasn't just me, is they not only wanted not to pay the people they poisoned in Ecuador, you know, they not only wanted to win the case, they wanted to kill the idea that this kind of case could happen. They wanted to kill off the idea of this case. And by locking me up, and I think had I not been protected by these great lawyers and literally thousands of people around the world who rallied to my defense, I think they had other plans for me too, potentially. And, you know, we talk about social media. When I got detained, I might have had, I don't know, a few hundred Twitter followers, X followers. Now I have over 200,000. And I started to chronicle my journey online, and I started to get a lot of engagement. And I would argue that that helped protect me a lot. Because when you get support and solidarity, it's harder for them to get you. And like having Natali as from the Water Protector Legal Collective, who's someone I admire so much personally and who's an incredible lawyer, stand by me. It's just so important for so many reasons. You know, I never started out, I'm going to help Indigenous people. That was never in my mind. I just wanted to do an interesting case and, you know, go after a corporation that was committing harm. And I realize I have been able to have the honor of sort of having the protection, because the work I did is about that, right? Even if I wasn't like fully conscious of it. So that's just really important to me, and I'm so privileged, and I never take it for granted. There's a lot more, you know, I could say. I just want to make one final point, which is there's a deep, deep, deep connection in the world right now, and particularly in the United States, between the survival of what I would call liberal democracy and the planet and the ability to do this work. They're trying to shut down this work. You know, there are laws being passed. I think now it's 19 states that provide draconian sentencing enhancements for protesting at an oil installation versus, say, protesting at like a Walmart. Jessica Resnicek is in prison right now. A woman in her early 40s. She vandalized a pipeline, committed an act of peaceful civil disobedience during Standing Rock. And she was facing a 3-year sentence, and she got before the court, and the Department of Justice asked for a terrorist enhancement. And the judge imposed an additional 5 years on the 3-year sentence, and she's now serving 8 years for an act to save the planet that harmed no person. And these are all messages. You see this, by the way, in Atlanta with the Cop City protesters, 61 people facing a bogus racketeering case. The criminalization trend, you see it in the RICO case filed against me, where by the way, I'm the only defendant in a civil RICO case denied a jury in the history of this country. And didn't give me a jury. Aaron didn't mention that. I never got a jury. It's all about criminalization. So I'm really proud as heck to be here right now. I'm so proud of what, the communities that I've had the privilege of working with have accomplished. This case, not my case, their case is still viable. There are lawyers in the world, I don't know their names yet, but I know they are going to materialize to carry the enforcement of this judgment forward, such that these communities, these long-suffering communities that are so proud, so resilient, so strong, will get the funds they need to restore their environment and restore the damage that's been caused to their cultures. I know what's going to happen. It's in the air. And it doesn't matter whether I'm here or not. It will happen. I know what's going to happen. So I'm super proud of what's been accomplished. I'm super proud to appear with you folks. Love what you do. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
We'd now like to open it up for any questions from the audience. Okay. I'll get you, Auntie Sandra, and then I'll come here.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to know, when you've done these cases and you have a team of people, who do you have an insurancer who takes on the case, or how do you do it? Do you do it pro bono or with an insurancer?
That's a great question. I can tell you don't litigate in the United States by that question.
Yes, in Australia.
Yeah, I know. Like, who's covering the costs if you lose? So the economic model that has allowed us to sustain this case still is what I would call, and please don't get offended anybody by this term, but I would call it capitalism in service of human rights. And it works like this. Basically, in the U.S., there's a strong tradition, as you probably know, plaintiff side law, where lawyers can finance, civil damages cases with their own funds or other people's funds. And in return, if they win, they get 1/3 of the recovery, and the client gets 2/3. But if they lose, the client doesn't have to pay anything. So it's like a risk collaboration, which in one respect allows people with no money a lot of access to our legal system. In another respect, a lot of lawyers take advantage of that, frankly, and make a ton of money in this country. I mean, if you get a $500 million settlement, you get 1/3. I mean, you could become very wealthy. And what we did is we took that concept and we basically got private investment money into the case. Law firms and others would put, literally millions of dollars, because this is an extremely expensive case to do. By the way, Chevron spent $3 billion. Frankly, we spent over 30 years, $30 million. It's not even that much, obviously, compared to what they spent, but it's money, And in exchange for investing, people would get a percentage of whatever recovery might happen. This model, I think Aaron would agree, terrified the fossil fuel industry, and it terrified Chevron. And what they did, one of the things they did besides lock me up, is they got an order from the U.S. judge. I think it's illegal, but we haven't been able to really deal with it, that I could no longer help my clients sell portions of their interest or investment money. I mean, they basically, it's almost like issuing a legal edict that I couldn't do my job. So the clients can get money. out of Ecuador, but I can't be involved in it. And that was one of my main roles, is like I would find sources of capital and hook those sources up with the communities in Ecuador. And I think what blew Chevron's mind is the idea that these communities that they have no money as we know money. I mean, they have a lot of wealth and prosperity because they live in the forest, but they don't work on our system of consumerism and money and materialism. And what freaked out Chevron is the idea that they figured out a way, by working with our team, to get millions of dollars, to pay lawyers to access the justice system. Shocking. I mean, in other words, what every company has the right to do, every commercial entity, every individual with resources has the right to do. Suddenly, these people with no money, as we know what we're doing. And it resulted in this historic victory. So they got an order that we could no longer do that. I hope that answers your question. Sorry for the long answer.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations on this really powerful side event, given after a long week and everybody's tired and it's pretty late. You could certainly feel the energy, and it's really important because we could never overemphasize this issue of criminalization of land rights defenders, environmental defenders. I come from Belize, I'm Kekchimaya, and I understand the allyship with lawyers that are willing to put themselves out there. Some of us, Indigenous peoples, are paying with our lives. We all know being thrown in jail for, trumped up charges and having to put your life on hold. I myself was arrested after we won a significant case in Belize in 2015 that recognized our rights to our lands and resources, and for a year was silenced from speaking because we had these charges hanging over my head. So I understand and it resonates with me. My question then is, we get these great judgments. We do win cases many times. How do we actually make the change on the ground? Because I'm left as an Indigenous leader with my communities thinking we spent 30 years of litigation. We put our lives on hold. We faced many, 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 many threats. And still, we're not able to see the changes on the ground, right? We're still not able to see the results. And it's disheartening to Indigenous communities. Where do we go from here? Right now, we do have an oil company coming onto our lands, and our communities, unfortunately, 10 years ago, their position was no to the oil company. Today, it's different. It's hard for me to tell my communities no to oil companies because there is this economic vulnerability that they're faced with. And so strategically, the only thing we could do as Indigenous land defenders is to say, okay, let us push the companies to really go through a free, prior, informed consent process, to really try to see if we can get some benefit sharing agreements so that you yourself as a community can see that these corporations, these companies, they're not interested in sharing benefits. They're not interested in your interests and needs. And hopefully, by that strategy, the community can then withhold their consent. That's the hope. But we're up against a lot. And a lot of times we see we won, for instance, a settlement of $6 million 2 years ago, and we're not able to see a penny of it as well for development that's happening on our lands, that's desecrating our waters and our lands. So I struggle as an Indigenous leader to try to convince my communities that this is worthwhile, that we have to continue because we don't see actual results on the ground. So I wanted to just hear your take on that. Thanks.
It's I think a struggle that as attorneys we also struggle with, and human rights defenders, because on the one hand we have this $9.5 billion judgment in the Chevron case, the case that you're mentioning in Belize. There are other cases where Aaron and I earlier were talking about the need, and it resonates with what Joan was saying too about the need for corporate accountability, even in the context of a just transition towards a greener economy, right, with all of these extractive projects that are also part of green colonialism, right? It's a new form of colonialism, really with the intention of continued extraction. I think for our theory of change as attorneys and the way that we see this also as human rights defenders and as Indigenous peoples, I think the knowledge comes with the need to continue swimming upstream, which is something that David Choquehuanca also said, in the past couple of days, that the fish that continues swimming upstream is the one that reaches the source and the fountain. And I find a lot of hope in that. And I think it's difficult to find hope in these colonial systems that are systematic, as Joan was saying. They're systematic, they are meant to oppress, and they're not built for us. And so even when we have a victory, it is often symbolic. But I believe that there's a lot of power in the symbolism, because the way that we see the law is that it is a social construct. It is something that we are collectively building and we're also collectively responsible for. And if we have the opportunity and the ability to poke holes and create gaps and show where the difficulty of the law and where the law is failing us, it's where we begin to show, yes, the law is under siege, right? The law is something that is not sacrosanct, that we have the ability, and not only the ability, but the responsibility to challenge and continue to try to push forward. And so thank you for your struggles. And thank you to all of our Indigenous relatives that are in this room that have continued to struggle and that continue to do so in our ancestral lands and territories. We know that this fight is difficult, and we know that this fight is tiring, and it's a difficult fight. But I also find a lot of hope in this room, right? The ability to come together, not just as Indigenous peoples, but with our allies, knowing that we have not just human rights defenders, experts in international law, attorneys, and overall the power of the community itself to rally together and build something and push forward. Because someone asked me the other day, what do you think about rights of nature? And I said, it's wonderful if it goes hand in hand with a understanding that is community-led. And I don't think we can do anything if we don't have the people at the heart of it. So thank you for your struggles, and we have to just continue fighting and be the fish that continue swimming upstream, because that is, no nos queda otra, right? We have to continue doing it. But it's also with the hopefulness and with the experience that we're learning from every new fight. Because one thing that we saw in Stephen's case, and I'm glad Stephen's here. I love Stephen and Aaron, and they're friends and have become family over many years now. But we didn't want to highlight just Stephen's case, right? This is a precedent, but this is something that can happen to any of us. And so that's the importance here, is that the corporations are learning and they're sharing information. We know that after Standing Rock, the Sheriff Kirchmeier over at Morton County went on a speaking tour around the nation to talk about how law enforcement should deal with Indigenous peoples, right? How to use force and excessive violence essentially against Indigenous peoples and other communities. So they're sharing information and they're learning from one another. And this is our time to learn from each other, and our time to come together and learn from each other and learn from our struggles, so that we know how to do it in a proactive way and do it together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks to each one of our panelists. It's been such a fruitful conversation. In closing, I would like to get a response from each of you, starting with Joan. What would you like to leave those in attendance with today? Briefly as possible. But what are some last final thoughts?
For me, it's more that we should not give up hope, and we should continue to work together and build our solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to echo what Joan said earlier about free, prior, and informed consent, and also just honoring our elders that have done this work for many, many, many years and have paved the way for where we are now. Today, earlier at the UN, there was an elder that was there, and she was sharing, how long this road has been just to get to where we are, to have a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. But it's not a convention yet, right? There's other ways to keep pushing, not just on the domestic level, on the international level, on every single level that we can, just pushing the boundaries of the law. But we can't do that alone via the law. We have to do it hand in hand with our communities and never lose sight of who we are and where we come from. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess partially an answer to the question as well, lawyers are not the answer. Lawyers are not the answer. There's been a lot of mention of lawyers here. Lawyers are not the answer. And I think as we're in this really beautiful moment for Indigenous peoples and self-determination is being built in really exciting new ways, the role of lawyers, especially outside lawyers, is going to need to be rethunk, in order to figure out how that works for self-determination, works to building power in different ways, and solving problems. I guess the last thing, because I mentioned hope earlier, and I guess my hope is similar to the swimming upstream, to the bearing witness. I think sometimes with legal solutions and legal framing, we are looking for these concrete, time-limited answers. And also in human rights, we have a concept of bearing witness, which is, from a legal concept, is losing sometimes, right? And watching, but being aware of the injustice, and holding space for those who are harmed in the injustice as we move forward. And that's as core a concept in human rights as there is. And I think that's important to also avoid burnout in our work, right? So that we know that we can sustain this over time. And bearing witness is a beautiful tradition that we can lean into as we do that as well.
Couple of points. I'm intrigued by your question, our leader from Belize. It's something I've thought about a lot. I mean, we have something in common, which is we are parts of teams that won cases that haven't been collected, where the judgments have not been respected. And, one sort of psychological trick I pulled in my own head might be of use. It's no substitute, obviously, for collecting the money, to be clear, but I sort of redefine what we did as a victory. I was for years, I was like, oh my God, we haven't collected the money. I'm like, wait a second. No, we won. The court, Ecuador's highest court, affirmed our judgment in the jurisdiction where Chevron wanted the trial held. That is a historic fact that will never be erased. We won. Once you sort of look at it that way, like you redefine what wins and losses are. So you've won your case, okay? And then you just can talk about how you won the case, and suddenly people might sort of, in courts even, might say, yeah, like why hasn't this money been collected? And I think that kind of energy maybe can make a marginal difference, And the other thing I'd say is doing the case. Just doing the case, getting it into court, even short of winning, is a huge step forward often for those harmed. Again, no substitute for collecting. But I don't know, Aaron, how if you would agree with this, but the case we did in Ecuador and are still doing has pulled together communities in ways that I think never would have happened. United farmer communities, indigenous communities, everyone harmed. Raise the profile of what Chevron did to a great degree such that many, many millions of people around the world know about it. That has imposed a cost on the company in reputation and aggravation and money because they've spent $3 billion on lawyers trying to not pay the people they poisoned. And I would argue that there is a significant measure of corporate accountability in the process of doing the case, even if you fall short of the goals we have and obviously you have. And I'm not saying this to try to rationalize the fact that we haven't actually gotten the money. That stinks. But what they most want is for us to think it can never be done and we just stop even trying. And I think that's something we can never give them. When I got locked up, I'm like, I'm never gonna They took my freedom. They're not going to take my happiness. I mean, I was miserable half the time, but I was like, I cannot let them take my happiness. So we had dinners at night and people came, so you just take your reality. By the way, I shouldn't be preaching you. You know this better than I do, I'm sure. But you just figure out how to keep resisting because, resistance is in and of itself a form of victory, in my opinion.
And just to add, we resist every day through our existence, right? Something like we like to talk about at WPLC is the front lines are everywhere. The front lines are here in the UN. The front lines are back home. The front lines are in the courtroom sometimes. It's everywhere we go because we carry the spirit of our ancestors and we carry this resistance forward everywhere. And in the spirit is also what Natali was talking about in honoring our elders. I'd like to ask our relatives at the People's Forum to play our final closing video. Thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. We have pizza, we have drinks at the end. Please take some and mingle and talk. And we also have, thank you for the reminder, tote bags, T-shirts, informational stuff from some of our relatives on carbon offsets. And thank you.
What does it take to stop the pipeline? Wow. If there was someone walking around with that one answer, we probably wouldn't have to be standing here. But the truth is that the questions that are being asked are for everybody. They're for everybody. So maybe what it takes to stop is changing some hearts. And when we change some hearts, we then know that we can travel and change some minds. The mind's the tool we can use to think all of that out. That's the way it would be explained here. And yet, I know others who would say that mindfulness it takes of the mind, of the many layers of the mind, to allow us to collectively understand that we have choice to make together. If we feel disempowered, if we've been marginalized, if we feel fearful, if we feel lost, if we feel indifferent. In fact, it's each one person that has to do that together or it doesn't happen. It's a collective thing that human beings need to decide together.
Can you feel it? Can you feel it? Feel the hunger of a calling. Yes, it's here and getting nearer. All the mother's cry is dawning. Can you hear it? Can you hear it? Can you hear the women rising? Can you see, oh can you see it? See us coming out of hiding. Awaken inspiration, therefore transformation. Turn this love to action. Blossom, blossom, blossom. This is a call to stand. This is a call to stand. This is your call to stand. This is our call.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate that. That was Johnny Asserin from Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, Nocheti Shakoin. We just wanted to pay a little tribute to our roots at Standing Rock, and thank you all for standing with us and standing with Indigenous peoples.